When Senator Mark Warner confronted FBI Director Kash Patel, it didn't just expose a controversial decision, it revealed a chilling timeline that compromised national security. January 27, 2025, 12 names were removed from a unit most Americans have never heard of. CI-12, the FBI's elite Middle East counterintelligence team. This was the group responsible for tracking Iran-linked threats inside the United States and maintaining the integrity of targeting intelligence connected to Iranian assets. 27 days later, the United States entered a major conflict with Iran, and inside a Senate hearing room on March 18, 2026, one senator placed that date back on the table and asked the only question that mattered, without ever phrasing it as one. This is not a normal hearing, and it never was. Not because of the conflict alone, not because of the witnesses lined up across that table, and not because of the cameras that had been rolling for over an hour before the moment everyone is now watching even began. This is a hearing about causation, about sequence, about whether a decision made quietly, administratively, on a January morning can be separated from the tragic outcomes that followed in February, March, and beyond. It is a hearing about whether national security is a phrase that explains decisions or a shield that prevents those decisions from ever being examined. And it is a hearing where Kash Patel, director of the FBI, was forced to sit in the space between those two possibilities with nowhere to go. The document Mark Warner held was not classified. That is the first detail that matters. It was not an internal intelligence memo, not a redacted briefing, not something hidden behind clearance levels and closed doors. It was a CNN report dated March 3rd, publicly available, describing the removal of 12 agents and support staff from CI-12, and outlining in plain language what that unit did and what the dismissals meant for the FBI's Iran program. Warner held a second document as well, an analysis from the same week, confirming the same point from a different angle. These were not generic personnel changes, not routine restructuring, but the dismantling of a specialized capability built over years to track a specific threat. He did not need to read them out loud. He did not need to dramatize them. The point was simpler and far more dangerous. Anyone watching could verify this themselves. That is how you remove the escape route of classification. That is how you make a claim unavoidable. And before he ever turned those documents into a question, Warner did something else, something that changed the frame of the entire hearing. He built a sequence. Austin, Texas. A man wearing clothing designed with Iranian flag imagery walks into a bar and fatally harms two people. An attack investigators are examining for potential extremist motivation. Old Dominion University, Virginia. A convicted extremist group supporter, a man who had already been through the system, walks into an Army ROTC classroom and fatally strikes the instructor, injuring others, and at the time of that attack, he is not on any active monitoring list, Minab, Iran. 165 children and teachers lost their lives when an aerial projectile strikes an elementary school adjacent to a military base, using targeting coordinates that are 17 months old. Data drawn from a system that is supposed to be updated, validated, maintained. 3 events, different locations, different immediate causes, different operational contexts, and Warner did not claim that CI-12 would have prevented all of them. He said that explicitly. But what he did say, and what he forced into the record, is that the unit responsible for tracking Iran-linked threats domestically and supporting intelligence quality related to Iranian targets had been stripped of the people who built it. 27 days before the United States entered a major conflict, where those exact capabilities would matter the most. This is where the hearing stops being about performance and starts being about logic. because the defense Kash Patel attempted to deploy is one we have heard before. The FBI's counter-extremism and counterintelligence capacity has remained fully operational. That sentence sounds complete. It sounds like an answer, but when you place it next to a date, next to a unit name, next to a list of terminated specialists, it stops functioning as an explanation and starts functioning as a placeholder, a sentence designed to occupy space where specifics should be. Warner did not interrupt him. He did something more precise. He waited 3 seconds. No follow-up, no raised voice, no rhetorical flourish. Just silence, directed at a statement that, on its own, cannot carry the weight being placed on it. And then he introduced the next document into the chain. Joe Kent, director of the National Counterterrorism Center, resignation letter submitted 2 days before the hearing, stating publicly that he could not support the major conflict with Iran because he did not believe Iran posed an imminent threat to the United States. That matters for 2 reasons. First, Kent is not a commentator, not a pundit, not an outsider speculating about intelligence. He is the administration's own counter-extremism chief, a man whose job is to synthesize threat assessments across agencies, including the FBI. Second, his statement speaks directly to the intelligence picture that existed before the strikes began. The picture that CI-12, the very unit Patel dismantled, was supposed to help construct from the domestic counterintelligence side. Now the sequence is no longer abstract. January 27th, CI-12 is gutted. In the weeks that follow, the intelligence picture is shaped without those specialists. The major conflict begins. The attacks occur. The targeting failure happens. And the official responsible for coordinating counter-extremism resigns publicly, stating that the underlying premise of the conflict does not align with the intelligence. This is what evidence stacking looks like when it is done correctly. Each piece on its own can be explained away. Together, they form a line that demands explanation. And when Warner turned back to Kash Patel, he did not ask, "Why did you do this?" He asked something more specific, more difficult to evade. He asked what the FBI's domestic Iran threat picture looked like without the people who built it, and whether anyone in the administration understood how degraded that picture was before the projectiles flew. Notice what is being measured there. Not intent, not motivation, capacity, awareness, consequence. These are the categories that matter in a system that claims to operate on intelligence rather than impulse. Patel's response did not address any of them. Instead, he moved to classification. He stated that he was not in a position to discuss the specific content of threat assessments in an open setting. That is a familiar move, and sometimes it is a legitimate one. There are details that cannot be disclosed publicly, but Warner had already removed the protection that classification usually provides by anchoring his argument in publicly available documents, publicly reported events, and a resignation letter released by the administration itself. You cannot classify a date. You cannot classify a dismissal that has been confirmed. You cannot classify a fatality that has already occurred. And you cannot classify the absence of an answer when the question is about structure, not secrets. So, Warner shifted again. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more formal. He requested a closed-door briefing within 7 days on CI-12's current operational capacity, the gap created by the January 27th dismissals, and the adequacy of domestic Iranian threat monitoring since Operation Epic Fury began. Then, he placed the acknowledgement form in front of Kash Patel. This is the moment where the hearing becomes something else entirely, because this is no longer a debate. It is a record. The Senate Intelligence Committee is not asking informally, it is documenting a demand for information tied to a specific decision and a specific timeline. Patel's attorney intervened, attempting to redirect the process into established channels. Warner's response was immediate and precise. This is the established channel, this room, this committee, this hearing, and Patel signed in silence. That silence is different from the earlier one. The earlier silence followed an insufficient answer. This silence follows a forced acknowledgement, a moment where the FBI director on live television commits to providing a detailed accounting of a decision he has not yet explained publicly. Now step back from the exchange itself and look at what has been constructed. A date, a decision, a degraded capability, a contested intelligence picture, a major conflict, a series of fatalities, a resignation, and a public commitment to explain how those pieces fit together. This is not partisan theater. This is not a clash of personalities. This is the basic question of whether a system designed to protect the public can remove a critical part of its own defensive structure immediately before a conflict, and still claim that nothing essential was lost. Because if that claim holds, then capacity means nothing. And if it does not hold, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who knew the capability had been degraded? When did they know it? And why did the major conflict proceed anyway? And that is where the hearing stops being about Kash Patel alone. Because the moment you accept that intelligence capacity can be reduced without consequence, you are no longer evaluating a single decision. You are evaluating a system that either did not see the risk or saw it and moved forward regardless. So here is what was said. The FBI remains fully operational. And here is what was not said. Which agents replaced the ones removed? What specific capabilities were lost? Whether monitoring gaps existed? Whether those gaps were identified before or after the attacks? And whether the intelligence used to justify the conflict accounted for the absence of the people who would normally build that picture? Those are not minor details. Those are the difference between a functioning system and a failing one. And as the hearing continued, with Tulsi Gabbard deflecting questions about pre-strike warnings, with John Ratcliffe staying carefully within the lines of what he could say, with Lieutenant General James Adams III declining to elaborate on the Meenab strike, Kash Patel sat at the far left of that table and did not speak for 11 minutes, not because there were no questions left, but because the one that mattered had already been asked, in a form that did not require a question mark at the end. And for those 11 minutes, nothing replaced that question. No new line of inquiry diluted it. No procedural interruption softened it. No competing headline pulled attention away from the single thread that now ran through the entire hearing like a fault line no one in that room could step around. Because once a decision is anchored to a date, and that date is anchored to consequences, the only thing left is explanation. And that was the one thing Kash Patel did not provide. So instead, the hearing moved. But it did not move on. Tulsi Gabbard was pressed again, this time on whether she had warned the White House about the Strait of Hormuz escalation risk before Operation Epic Fury began. And her answer, careful, layered, structured to sound complete without ever becoming specific, only reinforced the pattern that had already been established. John Ratcliffe followed with statements about Iranian proxy capabilities, language polished by years inside the system, sentences that sounded authoritative but were calibrated to remain just inside the boundary of what could be said publicly without creating new obligations to explain what had already happened. Lieutenant General James Adams III returned to the Meenab strike. The elementary school, the outdated targeting coordinates, and again the phrase under investigation appeared, a phrase that signals process while postponing accountability. And through all of it, the question Warner constructed did not dissolve. It expanded. Because every answer given by the other witnesses had to exist alongside the reality that one piece of the intelligence architecture, the domestic Iran counterintelligence unit inside the FBI, had been deliberately reduced just weeks before all of this unfolded. This is where the logic begins to tighten, because intelligence is not a single report. It is not a document that appears fully formed. It is a system built from inputs, from analysts, from field reports, from monitored subjects, from signals that only become meaningful when someone trained to recognize patterns connects them. Remove the people who perform that function, and the system does not collapse immediately. It continues to produce output. It continues to generate reports, briefings, assessments, but the quality of those outputs is no longer what it was. And more importantly, the system itself may not know that it has been degraded. That is the part no one said out loud in that hearing. Because to say it would be to admit that decisions made inside one agency can quietly alter the reliability of the intelligence that every other agency depends on. And that is not a partisan problem. That is a structural one. So when Kash Patel said the FBI remained fully operational, the statement can be true in the narrowest possible sense. Agents are still in the field, reports are still being filed, threat assessments are still being generated. But operational is not the same as intact, and it is not the same as uncompromised. That distinction is where the entire hearing lives, because Warner was not asking whether the FBI was functioning. He was asking whether it was functioning at the level required for the situation the country had entered. Major conflict. 19 days of it at the time of that hearing. Domestic threats emerging. Foreign targeting decisions being executed. And a counter-extremism chief resigning rather than endorse the intelligence basis for the conflict. That is not background noise. That is the environment in which the January 27th decision must be evaluated. Now, consider the timing again, because timing is everything in this kind of analysis. January 27th, CI-12 is gutted. February unfolds with whatever internal adjustments the FBI attempts to make. Reassignments, redistribution of workload, attempts to maintain continuity without the specialists who built that capability. March 18th, the hearing takes place, 19 days into a major conflict that began without the full structure that had existed just weeks earlier. And in between those points, 3 events that Warner places on the record. Not hypotheticals, not projections, events. Each one exposing a different aspect of what intelligence failure can look like. In Texas, the question is motivation and detection. A man wearing Iranian flag imagery commits a deadly attack, and investigators are left to determine whether it is extremist-related, whether it connects to broader networks, whether there were indicators that could have been identified earlier. In Virginia, the question is monitoring. A convicted extremist group supporter, already known to the system, is not on any active watch list when he enters a classroom and fatally harms an Army ROTC instructor. That is not a failure of imagination. That is a failure of tracking. And in MENAB, the question is data integrity. An aerial projectile strikes an elementary school because the targeting coordinates were 17 months out of date, drawn from a database that depends on continuous validation, continuous updating, continuous human oversight. 3 different domains: detection, monitoring, validation, and one common factor: human expertise. The kind that does not get replaced overnight. The kind that does not scale instantly when removed. The kind that, when lost, creates gaps that are not always visible until something goes wrong. This is where Warner's approach becomes prosecutorial in the purest sense. He does not claim that one decision caused all 3 outcomes. He does something more disciplined. He establishes that a capability existed. He establishes that it was reduced. He establishes that events occurred in areas where that capability would have been relevant. And then he asks for an explanation of how the system functioned without it. That is how you build a case without overreaching, because overreach creates escape routes. Precision removes them, and Kash Patel's answers, or lack of answers never engage with that precision. They remain at altitude. At the level of general capability, institutional strength, ongoing operations, all of which may be true, but none of which address the specific question being asked. This is not accidental. This is how institutional language is designed to work. It protects the organization from committing to statements that can later be disproven. It avoids specifics that create liability. It maintains a posture of competence without opening the door to verification. But in a setting like this, where the facts are already partially public, where the sequence has been laid out, that language begins to sound less like caution and more like evasion. And that is where the moral dimension begins to rise. Because behind every category, behind every term, behind every carefully constructed sentence, there are people. Two people in Texas who did not know they were part of a threat picture. An Army instructor in Virginia who walked into a classroom expecting a routine day. 165 children and teachers in Minab, whose lives intersected with a targeting database that had not been updated in 17 months. These are not abstractions. These are outcomes. And when those outcomes are placed next to a decision that removed expertise from the system designed to prevent them, the question is no longer technical, it is ethical. What level of certainty is required before you remove a capability tied to a known threat? What level of risk is acceptable when that threat is not hypothetical but ongoing? And who bears responsibility when the answer to those questions turns out to be wrong? Because that is the part no one in that hearing said directly. Not Warner, not Patel, not any of the witnesses, but it is the part that defines everything else. If the decision on January 27th was justified, then there must be a clear, articulable reason why removing those agents did not degrade the system in a way that mattered. If it was not justified, then the consequences of that decision extend beyond internal personnel management into the realm of national security failure. There is no third category, and that is why Warner did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to accuse. He did not need to dramatize. He only needed to place the pieces in order and leave them there. Because once they are in order, the burden shifts. It is no longer on the questioner to prove the connection. It is on the person who made the decision to explain why the connection does not exist. And for 11 minutes, Kash Patel did not do that. He sat at the far left of the witness table, next to the Director of National Intelligence, next to the CIA Director, next to the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, surrounded by the full architecture of American intelligence leadership. And he said nothing. Not because he was not asked, but because the answer required something he had not yet provided. Specificity. Specificity is where accountability begins. And it is also where it becomes most dangerous for the person who has to provide it. Because the moment Kash Patel moves from the FBI remains fully operational to this is exactly what was lost. This is exactly who replaced it. This is exactly how we compensated for the gap. The conversation stops being abstract and becomes measurable. And measurable claims can be tested. They can be compared against timelines, against outcomes, against internal communications, against the testimony of other agencies that relied on the same intelligence stream. That is the threshold Patel never crossed in that hearing. And Mark Warner knew exactly where that threshold was. This is what distinguishes a political exchange from a prosecutorial one. A political exchange seeks a statement. A prosecutorial exchange seeks a commitment. Warner was not interested in forcing Patel into a rhetorical misstep. He was interested in locking him into a factual position that could be examined later, in a closed-door briefing, under oath, with documents on the table. That is why the acknowledgement form mattered more than any single answer, because answers can be shaped in the moment. Records cannot. Now step into that moment again. not as a viewer, but as someone inside the system. You are one of the agents who worked in CI-12. You spent years building networks, tracking patterns, understanding how Iranian-linked actors operate inside the United States, how signals appear, how they evolve, how they connect. You know which cases are active, which individuals require monitoring, which data streams require constant validation. And on January 27th, you are removed. Not reassigned within the same mission. Removed. Your access ends. Your cases are handed off, if they are handed off at all, to people who did not build them. Your knowledge is no longer part of the system in real time. Now, extend that forward. Weeks pass, events occur, and in March, you watch a Senate hearing where the director of the FBI states that the system remained fully operational. What does that mean to you? Does it mean your work was redundant? Does it mean your absence did not matter? Or does it mean the system is presenting itself as whole, even when parts of it have been removed? That is not a rhetorical question. That is a structural one. Because systems like this do not fail in obvious ways. They fail in margins, in missed connections, in signals that are not recognized because the person who would have recognized them is no longer there, in data that is technically present but functionally degraded, because the context required to interpret it has been lost. This is what Warner is pointing at without ever needing to say it explicitly. And this is why Patel's reliance on institutional language becomes more than just cautious. It becomes revealing, because the refusal to engage with specifics in a moment where specifics are the only thing that matters is itself a form of information. It tells you where the pressure is. It tells you what cannot be easily defended, and it tells you what will likely surface when the conversation moves behind closed doors. Now, add another layer. Joe Kent's resignation is not just a disagreement, it is a signal. When the director of the National Counterterrorism Center states publicly that he does not believe Iran posed an imminent threat, he is not speaking in isolation. He is speaking from access to the same intelligence ecosystem that includes the FBI, which means his statement intersects directly with the question Warner is asking. What did the intelligence picture look like before the major conflict? Who contributed to it? And what changed when those contributions were reduced? Because, if Kent is correct, if the intelligence did not support the urgency of the major conflict, then the removal of CI-12 specialists becomes even more consequential, not because it caused the conflict, but because it may have altered the quality of the information used to justify it. And if that is true, then the issue is no longer just about domestic threat monitoring. It is about decision-making at the highest level of government. This is where the hearing crosses a line that is rarely crossed in public, from operational failure into strategic legitimacy. Because once you question the integrity of the intelligence picture, you are not just asking whether the system worked, you are asking whether the system told the truth. And that is a question no institution answers easily. Now, return to the hearing room. Warner has already forced the acknowledgement. The record has been created. The timeline has been established. And the room understands, even if it is not being said directly, that the next 7 days matter, because that closed-door briefing will require Patel to move from generalities to details, from statements that sound complete to explanations that can be examined. And that is where the real risk lies. Not in what is said on camera, but in what must be said when the cameras are gone. Because inside that briefing, the questions will not be about whether the FBI is operational. They will be about numbers. How many agents replaced the 12 removed? What specific expertise did those replacements have? How long did it take for them to assume full responsibility for the cases they inherited? What gaps were identified during that transition? Whether any subjects previously monitored by CI-12 were no longer being actively tracked? Whether any data streams were interrupted, delayed, or deprioritized, whether any internal warnings were raised about the impact of the dismissals before the major conflict began? Those are the questions that turn a decision into a record. And once a record exists, it can be compared against outcomes. That is the mechanism of accountability. Slow, methodical, relentless, and impossible to fully control once it begins. Which brings us back to the moral frame that has been building underneath all of this. Because it is easy to lose sight of what is actually at stake when the conversation is dominated by terms like capacity, assessment, operational status. These are abstractions. They are necessary for professionals inside the system, but they are not what the public experiences. The public experiences outcomes. They experience whether someone was being monitored or not, whether a threat was identified or not, whether a piece of intelligence was current or outdated, whether a decision made in Washington has consequences in Texas, in Virginia, in Minab. That is the translation that rarely happens in real time. That is what Warner forced into the open. He took a personnel decision and placed it next to real-world events. Not to claim direct causation, but to force the question of responsibility. And responsibility is the one thing that cannot be abstracted away. It attaches to decisions, it follows timelines, and it does not disappear simply because the system continues to function in some form. So when Patel said, "Every decision I have made as director has been made in the interest of the FBI's mission and the national security of this country," that statement carries weight. It is a declaration of intent. But intent is not outcome. And in a system that measures itself by outcomes, intent is only the beginning of the analysis, not the end. This is the contradiction at the center of the hearing. A system that defines itself by its mission, but is being evaluated by its results. A director who asserts purpose, but is being asked to explain consequences. And a set of events that cannot be undone, only understood, which leads to the question that the hearing never states directly, but builds toward with every piece of evidence placed on the table. If the system can remove expertise tied to a known threat, enter a conflict involving that threat, and then respond to failures within that context by saying it remained fully operational, what does operational actually mean? Does it mean sufficient? Does it mean optimal? Or does it simply mean not collapsed? Because those are not the same thing. And the difference between them is measured in the spaces where things go wrong. And those spaces are where systems reveal what they actually are. Not in their briefings, not in their prepared statements, not in the language that has been refined over decades to sound precise without becoming vulnerable, but in the moments where something breaks and the explanation that follows cannot match the reality that people can see. That is where trust is either reinforced or it fractures. Because trust is not built on capability alone. It is built on the belief that when something goes wrong, someone can explain why in a way that holds together. And in that hearing room on that day, that explanation did not come. What came instead was a sequence that no one in that room could undo. January 27th. A decision. March 18th. A major conflict already 19 days in. Texas, Virginia, Minab, Joe Kent gone, and an FBI director who could not connect those points in a way that satisfied even the most basic demand for clarity. This is where the story stops being about process and becomes about permission. What are institutions allowed to do without explaining themselves? How much silence is acceptable when the consequences are visible? And at what point does the absence of an answer become an answer in itself? Because that is what 8 seconds of silence in a hearing room actually represent. Not confusion, not hesitation, constraint. The kind of constraint that appears when every available answer creates a problem that is worse than the silence. That is not a performance issue. That is a structural one. And it is why Warner's final line landed the way it did. I hope you can still believe that. I'm not sure I can. That is not a partisan statement. That is a collapse of confidence, stated plainly, without decoration, without escalation, without theatrics. It is what happens when a system asks to be trusted, and then cannot account for a decision that sits directly adjacent to loss of life. Now, consider what this means beyond that room, because hearings end, cameras turn off, statements get clipped, shared, debated, reframed. But the underlying question does not disappear. It moves into the space where institutions either correct themselves or continue as they are. The 7-day deadline Warner set is not just a procedural marker. It is a test of whether the system can produce a coherent internal account of its own actions. A test of whether the gap created on January 27th can be defined, measured, and explained. A test of whether the phrase fully operational survives contact with documentation. And if it does not, then the next question is unavoidable. Who approved the decision? Who reviewed its impact? Who signed off on the risk? And who decided that whatever that risk was, it was acceptable in the weeks leading up to a major conflict? Those are not questions of politics. They are questions of governance. Because governance is not about what works when everything goes right. It is about what happens when something goes wrong, and whether the system can trace that failure back to a point where it could have been prevented. That is the standard, and it is the standard that was placed quietly but unmistakably on Kash Patel in that hearing. Now, bring it back to the people whose lives intersected with this timeline. The two individuals in Texas who walked into a bar and did not walk out. The Army ROTC instructor in Virginia who entered a classroom and never left it. The 165 children and teachers in Minab whose day ended under an aerial strike tied to data that should not have been outdated. They are not part of a narrative. They are the reason the narrative exists, because without them, this is just a disagreement about management. With them, it becomes something else entirely. A question of whether decisions made in offices, signed on forms, justified in internal language, carry consequences that extend far beyond the people who made them, and whether those consequences are ever fully accounted for. This is the moral line that runs through everything Warner did in those 11 minutes. He did not accuse Kash Patel of causing those events. He did not claim a direct line of causation that could be easily dismissed. He did something more difficult. He placed the decision next to the outcomes and asked for an explanation that could withstand that proximity. That is how accountability works when it is done properly. It does not exaggerate. It does not speculate. It aligns facts and weights. And in that weighting, it reveals what cannot be said. So ask yourself, what was actually defended in that hearing? Was it the decision itself, or was it the ability to avoid explaining the decision? Because those are not the same thing. Defending a decision requires details, reasoning, evidence, acknowledgement of trade-offs. Avoiding explanation requires language, structure, and time. Time for the story to move on. Time for attention to shift. Time for the connection between January 27th and everything that followed to become less immediate, less sharp, less urgent. But that only works if no one insists on holding the timeline in place. And that is exactly what Warner refused to let happen. He fixed the timeline in the record. He attached it to names, dates, documents, and outcomes. He required a response that will now have to exist somewhere, even if it is not yet public. And that changes the equation. Because once something exists in the record, it can be revisited. It can be compared. It can be challenged. It can be expanded. It does not disappear. That is the difference between a moment and a mechanism. Moments fade. Mechanisms persist. And what happened in that hearing was not just a moment. It was the activation of a mechanism designed to force explanation where none had been given. Which brings us to the final question, the one that sits underneath everything else and does not resolve when the hearing ends. If a system tasked with protecting the public can remove critical expertise tied to an active threat, proceed into a conflict involving that threat, and then respond to failures within that context without providing a clear, verifiable explanation of how its capacity was affected, what exactly is the standard by which that system is judged? Is it intention? Is it effort? Or is it outcome? Because if it is outcome, then the conversation we just watched is not complete. It has only begun. And if it is not outcome, then the word accountability no longer means what it claims to mean. So, here is what you do next. You do not let the timeline dissolve. You do not let the language replace the facts. You follow the 7-day deadline. You watch what comes out of that closed-door briefing. You compare what is said there to what was said in public. And you decide for yourself whether the explanation, when it finally arrives, holds together. If it does not, that matters. If it does, that matters even more. Because this is not about one hearing, one senator, or one director. This is about whether the system that asks for trust can withstand scrutiny when that trust is tested. If you think this kind of accountability should not stop when the cameras turn off, hit like, share this with someone who needs to see how this actually works. Drop your take in the comments. And subscribe. Because the next piece of this story is already on the clock. And when it comes out, the only thing that will matter is whether it answers the question that has been sitting there since January